Most men today don't want love. They want emotional anesthesia in the form of attention. They want the notification, the quick reply, the view, the digital breadcrumbs to keep their ego breathing for a few more hours. And the most humiliating part? The guy hands over his entire dignity for it without even realizing it. He stays online waiting for a text like an on-call emotional security guard. His mood depends on a lit-up screen. A cold reply ruins his day. Being left on read shatters his self-esteem. And then he wonders why he lost his value. It's because a man who constantly needs attention broadcasts something highly dangerous: dependency. And dependency has never bred respect, only control. While one man loses his peace of mind checking his phone every 3 minutes, another vanishes for hours with zero anxiety. One lives desperately trying to be noticed, the other just lives his life. And that is exactly where the psychological discomfort is born. Because the man who doesn't need your attention becomes emotionally impossible to control. The needy guy chases. The dangerous guy observes. The needy guy wants a reply to soothe his insecurities. The dangerous guy doesn't turn validation into emotional oxygen, and that completely flips how the world reacts to him. There is a brutal difference between a man who is present and a man who is too available. The present man chooses where to invest his energy. The overly available one hands out VIP, all-access passes to his emotional state. And unlimited access tanks your value. Fast. Really fast. When you live your life trying to be remembered, texted back, chosen, and validated around the clock, you start looking emotionally cheap. You look like a product on a permanent emotional clearance sale. Always accessible, always ready, always waiting for someone's stamp of approval just to feel like you're enough. Now look at this closely. The dangerous man isn't the most aggressive, the coldest, or the most arrogant. He's the man who refuses to beg for attention. Because the exact second you stop emotionally depending on how people react to you, something in your posture shifts. You speak differently. You walk differently. You tolerate less disrespect. And most importantly, you stop chasing people who clearly enjoy your desperation more than your presence. But here's the catch. Most men have been brainwashed to believe that trying harder proves their worth. So the less attention they get, the more they overcompensate. Double texting, trying too hard, spiraling into anxiety, as if performative neediness was a sign of emotional depth. It's not. It's just the fear of not being enough without having to beg for someone to stick around. The modern man has been conditioned to measure his own worth by the reactions of others. Likes became self-esteem. Fast replies became proof of importance. Read receipts became an emotional thermometer. A guy wakes up and the very first thing he does is check if anyone remembered he existed while he was asleep. Heavy, right? But look around. The world is full of guys exactly like this. A woman takes 20 minutes to reply, and the guy hits the panic button, triggering a full-blown international diplomatic meltdown. His brain starts manufacturing theories, insecurities, and straight-up paranoia. Am I losing ground? Is she pulling away? Is there another guy? It's mind-blowing how a needy man can turn someone else's silence into a 3-hour psychological thriller. Now take a step back and think about this, and think. Whoever relies too heavily on validation inevitably settles for less than they deserve. Because emotional neediness erodes your boundaries. The man who needs to be chosen 24/7 starts putting up with ridiculous behavior just to keep getting scraps of attention. He tolerates disinterest. He tolerates absence. He tolerates disrespect paid in easy emotional installments. And you know the most ironic part? The more he bends over backwards to keep her attention, the less she respects him. Because extreme neediness never projected value. It projects desperation. And emotional urgency is a massive turnoff. Nobody looks up to someone who walks around begging for constant reassurance that they matter. The man who relies too much on others for validation loses touch with his own core. He outsources his emotions. If he gets attention, he feels like a king. If he doesn't, he falls apart. His life turns into an emotional stock market, crashing or peaking based on someone else's mood. But everything flips when a man wakes up to one brutal truth. The guy who needs too much puts up with anything. There's an unspoken rule that almost no one will admit out loud. Whatever is available all the time stops looking valuable. That applies to everything, including you. The man who always replies instantly, who drops everything when called and never sets an emotional boundary, starts blending into the background. Being around too much kills your impact. You just become white noise. The guy thinks that extreme availability shows he cares. In reality, it usually just shows he has no priorities of his own. Because a busy man building his life isn't sitting on emotional standby, just waiting for a chance to get some female attention. That's the routine of a guy who turned seeking validation into a part-time job. Let this sink in. When your time seems unlimited, your presence loses its weight. The guy who is too accessible kills the mystery before it's even born. There's no tension, no curiosity, not enough absence to create psychological value. And without psychological value, attraction suffers a slow death while the guy is still convinced he's doing everything right. The funny thing is, a lot of men sabotage themselves by trying to look indispensable. They do everything. They're always hovering. They fix problems they didn't even cause. They become a 24/7 emotional crutch. And then they're shocked when they realize they've just become a predictable convenience. Useful, but not respected. Because presence without boundaries turns you into part of the furniture, and nobody misses what never moves. But here's the detail that shatters a lot of male illusions. The man who learns the weight of absence starts to understand something dangerous. Your value skyrockets when your life doesn't revolve around the need to be remembered all the time. The man who knows how to step back without anxiety completely shifts the energy of a relationship. Because controlled absence broadcasts something incredibly rare these days, a life of his own. And a man with his own life is intimidating. Especially in a world full of people emotionally piggybacking on others just to feel valuable. While the desperate guy is sending a wall of text trying to win back her attention, the dangerous man simply turns his phone off and hits the gym. He goes to work. He builds something. He lives. Sounds simple, but it's not. Because most men don't know how to exist without constant emotional stimulation. They need the reply, the reassurance, the presence, the digital breadcrumbs dripping onto their ego non-stop. Look at this carefully. Absence doesn't create impact because you're playing games. It creates impact because it cuts off unlimited access. The man who isn't available 24/7 looks more valuable precisely because he doesn't reek of neediness. And extreme neediness always cheapens your perceived value. The needy guy thinks going MIA for a few hours will automatically drive a woman crazy. He totally missed the point. Absence without substance is just empty silence. What commands respect isn't doing a vanishing act. It's having a life so solid that your attention is no longer cheap. And you know what happens when a man stops living just to be noticed? People start noticing him. Cruel irony. Because human beings value what they realize isn't easily accessible. Not out of malice. It's just psychology. The rare catches the eye. The overly available becomes the scenery. A man who is emotionally occupied with his own goals projects calm. A man starving for validation projects urgency. And emotional urgency has a stench. People can smell it, even when they pretend they don't. But there's a dangerous trap in all of this. A lot of men learn the value of absence and start turning silence into a persona. That's when they stop being strong and just become poorly disguised manipulators. And this is where most guys fail miserably. They discover the power of absence and instantly morph into an emotionally stunted social media character. The guy memorizes a few quotes about detachment and starts ghosting people, secretly hoping they'll chase him. He stays silent, calculating their reaction. He disappears, praying someone comes looking for him. That's not strength. That's neediness dressed up as strategy. The weak man uses absence as emotional bait. The strong man simply doesn't live his life begging for someone to be there. They might look similar, but it changes everything. One stays quiet because he wants to control the narrative. The other stays quiet because he feels absolutely no need to fight for the spotlight all the time. Pay close attention here. The guy playing the silent game, waiting for validation, is still in an emotional prison. He's still dependent on how people react. He's still handing his peace of mind over to others, just in a more sophisticated way. Before, he begged by talking too much. Now, he begs by faking detachment. The prison is exactly the same. He just redecorated the cell. And the most ironic part? Women spot this from a mile away. Because there's a massive difference between natural absence and performative distance. The secure man steps back and keeps living his life normally. The insecure man steps back and monitors everything from the shadows like a retired emotional CIA agent. One projects peace. The other projects a bruised ego trying to look untouchable. True silence doesn't want to punish anyone. It doesn't want to manufacture artificial anxiety. It doesn't want to win some invisible emotional tug of war. It simply protects your energy. It protects your focus. It protects your dignity. And the man who masters this becomes truly dangerous because he no longer emotionally depends on anyone's constant presence. And when a man truly loses the need for validation, something in his eyes changes, in his behavior, in his posture. People feel it, even if they can't quite put their finger on why. There is something deeply unsettling about a man who doesn't need to be picked all the time, because he shatters an entire modern paradigm built on emotional validation. The guy doesn't beg for replies. He doesn't spiral when someone goes quiet. He doesn't take silence as a personal attack. He just keeps living. And that leaves a lot of people clueless on how to deal with him. The needy man is easy to predict, easy to string along, easy to manipulate. You just spoon-feed him attention in controlled doses, and boom, he hands over his time, his peace, his dignity, and his focus like he's paying back rent on his emotions. But the man with no desperate needs creates a serious psychological problem for people who thrive on control, because there are no emotional levers to pull on him. Look at this closely. The man who can sit in his own silence becomes impossible to tame. He doesn't need to chase anyone to calm his anxiety. He doesn't need to compete for attention to feel worthy. He doesn't need to be constantly remembered to know who he is. And when a man reaches that level of stability, his behavior changes naturally. Not because he's putting on an act, but because he's free. That's exactly when a lot of women feel the shift. Because emotionally dependent men are always trying to impress. The emotionally free man observes more than he proves. He talks less. He tolerates less. And above all, he walks away without making a scene the second he notices repeated disrespect. The funny thing is, the whole world tries to control needy men. Advertising controls them. Social media controls them. Relationships control them. The entire modern emotional system feeds off your constant need for approval. So when a man shows up who refuses to beg for attention, he looks dangerous. Not because he's cruel, but because he can no longer be led by the nose. But here's the classic mistake that ruins a lot of men at this exact stage. Some start confusing emotional independence with silent arrogance. This is where a lot of guys sabotage their own emotional growth. The guy finally learns to stop begging for attention, and immediately starts acting like he's ascended to becoming an untouchable higher power. He gets too cold, too distant, too unapproachable. He's not projecting strength. He's projecting an inflated ego trying to mask old insecurities. A secure man doesn't need to look important 24/7. An insecure man goes out of his way to perform superiority in every single interaction. He takes hours to reply on purpose, fakes artificial disinterest, and turns a simple conversation into a silent ego trip. It's exhausting. He looks like an emotional teenager trying to act mysterious after watching 2 YouTube videos on alpha masculinity. Let's get this straight. Emotional independence isn't about looking down on people. It's about not needing them in order to exist. The arrogant man builds walls to feel powerful. The strong man sets boundaries to protect his peace. One wants to look down from above, the other simply refuses to live below his own worth anymore. And you know what's funny? The guy with real presence doesn't need to broadcast his absence all the time. A secure man can show interest without losing his frame. He can like someone without becoming an emotional slave. He can get close without abandoning his own life in the process. Because emotional maturity doesn't kill connection, it only kills desperation. But a lot of wounded men confuse calm with permanent coldness, so they become exhausting caricatures. Everything is whatever. Everything is calculated distance. Everything is strategic silence. Deep down, they are still obsessed with validation. They just swapped out explicit neediness for performative superiority. Real power isn't about looking unreachable. It's about not needing to prove your worth around the clock. And when a man grasps that, he finally unlocks a freedom very few people ever experience. The freedom to exist without begging for a single drop of attention. There is a massive difference between having value and living your life trying to prove you have value. The man who begs for attention never gets a day off emotionally. He's always performing, always trying to impress, to please, to stay relevant, to avoid being forgotten. He lives like a door-to-door salesman of his own existence. It's exhausting. And the worst part, the harder he tries to be noticed, the less real impact he makes. Now, the man who doesn't need, he shifts the energy of a room without lifting a finger. Because he doesn't step into a conversation looking for a pat on the back. He doesn't enter a relationship begging to stay. He doesn't sit in silence terrified of being replaced. He simply exists without treating validation like life support. And that broadcasts a calm that very few people can successfully fake. Think about this deeply. The guy who doesn't need to beg for attention finally discovers his own worth. He realizes that his dignity outweighs a fast reply. That his peace of mind is worth more than emotional crumbs. That a lack of validation does not equal a lack of value. And when that switch flips in a man's head, a lot of things change on autopilot. He stops pushing where there's no reciprocity. He stops chasing people who clearly enjoy the ego boost more than they enjoy his presence. He stops over-explaining himself, trying to convince confused people to see his worth when all they see is his emotional utility, and that is exactly what makes him intimidating. Because an emotionally free man cannot be easily manipulated by the promise of attention. He doesn't lose his mind if a text takes too long. He doesn't have a meltdown if someone goes quiet. He doesn't tolerate disrespect just to keep from being alone. And in a world packed with men desperate for validation, that makes him look almost dangerous. An emotionally free man projects something incredibly rare today: stability. While the masses live their lives begging to be chosen, he chose his own peace of mind a long time ago. And this is exactly where maturity separates from manipulation. Because using this emotional freedom to play games with people is the fastest way to rot from the inside out. Pay close attention to this part because this is where a lot of men lose the plot without realizing it. They discover the power of not begging for attention and weaponize it to feed their own ego. They start using absence to spark anxiety, silence to trigger insecurity, and distance to emotionally manipulate people who still care about them. It's pathetic. The guy finally breaks out of the prison of neediness, only to become the emotional warden for someone else. An empty man loves playing the calculated detachment game. He ghosts people hoping they'll panic. He ignores them hoping they'll chase. He plays emotional games thinking he's displaying power. He's not. He's still completely dependent on how they react. He just changed the flavor of his neediness. Before, he begged for attention directly. Now he begs for it through his absence. Look at this clearly. The pinnacle of masculine strength isn't making someone chase you. It's not needing to tear anyone down to feel like a king. Because a truly strong man doesn't turn people into tools for his own emotional validation. He simply learns not to hand over his peace of mind for temporary company. And do you know what happens to the guy who uses silence as psychological torture? He slowly rots on the inside. He becomes entirely incapable of building a real connection. Everything is a game. Everything is a test. Everything is a silent ego clash. The guy stops actually experiencing relationships and starts managing emotional strategies like he's running a covert military op. It's exhausting. It's cold. It's hollow. A mature man uses distance to protect his dignity, not to inflict unnecessary emotional wounds. He uses silence to dodge chaos, not to manufacture dependency. Because at the end of the day, true emotional freedom doesn't stem from the desire to control others. It stems from the ability to control yourself. And when you finally learn that, you wake up to a brutal truth. The most dangerous man in the room was never the loudest or the most aggressive. It was the man who no longer desperately needed anyone's attention. In the end, the man who stops begging for attention doesn't become dangerous because he yells louder, treats people worse, or turns into a soulless emotional statue. He becomes dangerous because he is no longer controllable, and controllable people have always been a comfortable safety net for the world. A needy man will buy any crumb of emotional validation thinking he's found love. A strong man observes the patterns, reads the intentions, and walks away before he loses his own dignity. The majority of men today live in a state of constant emotional withdrawal. They need to be remembered, texted back, chosen, and desired around the clock. And when they don't get it, they crash in silence. Their mood flips, their posture slumps, their self-esteem tanks. They hand over their core stability to others like they're handing out their bank pin in a public square. The emotionally free man, on the other hand, understands a ruthless truth. Attention does not dictate value. A reply does not dictate importance. Someone else's presence does not dictate his identity. And the moment the truth gets hardwired into a man's brain, it's game over. The world loses its biggest leverage over him. But never forget this. Emotional independence is never an excuse to become an arrogant, cruel, or highly sophisticated manipulator. The goal was never to humiliate anyone. The goal was always to stop humiliating yourself trying to hold on to people who clearly didn't want to stay. Because a mature man doesn't beg for someone to stick around. He doesn't chase emotional crumbs. He doesn't fight for attention like an affection beggar standing in a digital soup kitchen. He simply guards his own peace and keeps building his life without turning someone else's absence into a personal tragedy. And here is the hard truth that shatters a lot of egos. When you finally learn how to live without desperately needing the attention of others, the whole world loses its grip on you. Comment down below. My peace is worth more than attention. And never forget, my friend, needy men beg for attention. Strong men attract respect.